Mr. Speaker, I move that we take up items in the unfinished business.
Please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I move that we take up House Bill number 9277 as contained in Committee Report number 770 and that the Secretary General be directed to read the title of said measure.
Secretary General, please proceed.
House Bill number 9277, an act instituting reforms to enhance the efficiency and dynamism of the Philippine capital markets, amending for the purpose sections 22, 24, 25, 121, 127, and 190 of Republic Act number 8424, otherwise known as the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended.
Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the parliamentary status of this bill is that we are in the period of sponsorship, debate, and interpellation. For this purpose, Mr. Speaker, I move that we recognize the sponsor of said measure, the Honorable Ray Reyes of Party-list Anakalusugan.
Party-list Anakalusugan Party-list Representative Ray Reyes, please proceed. You have the floor, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now move that we recognize the Honorable Arlene Rosas of Party-list Gabriela for her interpellation.
Congresswoman Rosas of Gabriela, please proceed, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Salamat, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the good sponsor yield to a few questions, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, happy to yield.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, recently, the House approved this year yung train package 4. At kasama dito yung stock transaction tax that would gradually be reduced to 0.1% for 5 years. Ano po yung kaibahan nung bill na ito sa ipinasa nating train 4, Mr. Speaker, ginong sponsor?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, doon po sa package 4, it accounts for a gradual reduction over a period of from January 2023 to January 2027, where we reduce by 0.1% over the said years. Dito po sa House Bill number 9277, it is proposed that we effect an immediate reduction, not of the gradual reduction, but immediate reduction to 0.1%. Ang justification po dyan, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, is there is a sense of urgency that we immediately be competitive with other markets in our region. If we will look at the cost of capital in the Philippines, also in our taxes on capital markets, we are the ones with the highest stock transaction tax, given that the kind of capital that comes in is very prohibitive. As it is right now, the Philippines is already second to the last in ASEAN 6 in terms of market capitalization. The reason for that is because each and every from Taiwan, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore have already reduced their stock transaction tax to 0.1%, and even in some markets, 0%. Vietnam is already at 0.1% and is already slowly approaching the Philippines in size of the market or in market capitalization. If we do not affect this kind of tax measure anytime sooner, we fear that we may be overtaken by Vietnam and be already the last in the ASEAN 6 in terms of market capitalization. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sa sinasabi niyo pong ASEAN 6, do we have to really sumunod sa kanila, Mr. Speaker? Kasi parang biglaan yung proposal from Train 4 is to gradually reduce, pero ito biglaan, 'di ba? So parang ano yung reason kung bakit biglaan? Is it because kailangan nating sumunod katulad ng ibang mga neighboring countries natin na ASEAN 6 para sabi natin ay pumasok yung mga foreign investors? Is that really the reason? Ano po yung primaryang dahilan, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, as reiterated po in my statement a while ago, it's not just a matter of compliance, but it is a matter of the urgency to compete. This stock transaction tax is an institutionalized measure by the state or the country in which it feels like it is the best way to compete for global markets to bring in capital from foreign investors. Not only that also, but also from local investors, so that any transaction that they transact in the stock market will be taxed less. In other words, any earnings that they have will have less taxes. This will incentivize them to come into the market even more. As a matter of fact, dito sa Philippines po, 1% of the population is participating in the stock market, the lowest in ASEAN 6. Indonesia is at 1.6%, but we have to understand they're close to 200 million people. We are at around 110 million people. We have also the lowest knowledge in terms of financial knowledge. Therefore, given this tax incentives, this will incentivize people to learn more about the financial markets, have more of our Filipinos actually participate in the capital markets, and make us more competitive in the region.
Mr. Speaker, sabi niyo kanina in compliance. Saan in compliance ito? Do we have an agreement with other countries? For example, na nagsasabi na kailangan mag-comply tayo dito, na ibaba natin itong taxes ng stock market, stock transaction tax, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, if I may re-clarify, it is not a matter of compliance, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague. It is us intending to compete with the capital markets.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Ginoong Sponsor, may we know what is the current magnitude of the capital market capitalization in the country?
Okay. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, if I may also, so that I could lend context onto the market cap.
Mr. Speaker, lagyan natin ng kasi baka mamaya way before yung sabihin mo. So, how is the capital market faring in the last 5 years in terms of magnitude and GDP share?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, what I have here is the stock transaction volume on our capital markets. Pre-pandemic, when our stock transaction tax was at around 0.5 or 0.6%, we have already discovered or realized a downtrend on market transaction and even on transaction volume. Given that our index in the stock market from a high of close to 9,000 because of the friction cost is already hovering at around 6,000 in our stock market index, which is a measurement of the participation in our markets, which means, like in the market cap of the Philippines right now is at $243 billion US dollars. But if you compare it to other countries within the ASEAN region, Indonesia is at 604 billion, Malaysia 370 billion, Singapore 606 billion, Vietnam at 178 billion, Thailand at 563 billion. Again, as I mentioned, we are already second to the last in terms of market size.
Mr. Speaker, ang tinatanong ko po ay yung how is our capital market faring in the last 5 years? So that would be 2018 to 2022. Do you have that data, Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Generally, ang sinasabi nyo kanina, I understand, bumababa. Tama? Yung capital market capitalization. Now, the question is, meron po ba kayo dyan?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, may I seek clarification? What information do you
Yes.
do you wish to acquire?
Yes, in the last 5 years, in terms of magnitude and GDP share, meron po ba kayong...
What we have here is the magnitude, which is the transaction volume in the past 5 years. So we were looking at from 2017 to 2022 po. In 2017, our transaction value is at around $2,200 million. So that would be about $2.2 billion. In 2018, it has reduced. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, I wish to reiterate, on 2017, it was at $3.2 billion in transaction value. On 2018, it became 2.7. It has reduced. 2019, it is at 2.9. 2020, it is at 3.0. 2021, it has increased to 3.6. And yet in 2022, it has reduced again to 2.6 billion US dollars. Yun na lang po yung size po natin. We are actually now below our 2018 levels.
Yes.
Mr.
Kasi
Speaker,
kung
distinguished
nag-start tayo ng 3.2, Mr. Speaker, bumagsak tayo hanggang 2.6 ngayon. 2020, that's the 2022, no? Na sinasabi ninyo. So, generally pababa, no? Yun yung trend. Ano-ano yung mga nakikitang salik dahilan kung bakit nagkakaganito? Although kasi, nung sinabi niyo po kanina yung Indonesia, they have a different story doon sa kanilang di ba? So dito sa Pilipinas, ano yung mga nakikitang dahilan kung bakit bumababa yung capital market capitalization dito?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, once again, it is because of the friction cost. In other words po, kung gaano kahirap gumawa ng transaction or even to create a business to access the capital markets. For example po, again, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, the transaction tax is about 0.10%. Singapore, it is 0%. Vietnam, 0.1%. Thailand, 0.11%. The Philippines is at 0.6%. Because there is a greater tax on productivity, there is a tendency for capital to go to where capital is utilized more efficiently, where they realize their earnings more, they are able to reinvest this into the capital markets, therefore increasing the size of the market. When you increase the size of the market, you are talking about infrastructure spending, we are talking about establishment of business, we are also talking about creation of jobs. So just the mere reduction of transaction tax removes the cost for people to transact here in the Philippines, which we intend in this bill should increase the market size and the economy consequently. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sinasabi niyo po na friction cost, tapos marami tayong mga dahilan na binanggit. But it is not primarily dahil mababa or kailangan nating babaan yung transaction tax, Mr. Speaker, ginong sponsor.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, it is the transaction tax po. Because, dito po sa atin on the sale of listed stocks, yung tax component po is 70, it's coming out here, that's the selling cost of a tax. For example, when we trade, it's coming at about 70% of the cost when we conduct transactions in the stock market. 70%, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, is very high. That kind of rate is prohibitive to people who wish to put in their capital and want an efficient use of their capital to expand the market.
So, bukod sa mga dahilan na yan, Mr. Speaker, are there any explanation kung bakit bumababa yung capital market capitalization dito?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, if I may, we are working with also case studies wherein reducing the transaction tax has a net positive effect on transaction volume. If I may cite the case of Taiwan stock market, even a reduction of 1/2 of their transaction tax, it was at 0.5, I believe it was reduced to 0.25, has gained a net effect of 6.33x on their transaction. In other words, even just reducing the transaction tax in half could have an effect of 6.33x in the transaction volume of our market. So what more, Mr. Speaker, if we will use the same arithmetic, that if we reduce it at 1.6, we could even increase our stock transaction volume even further than the 6.33x that we have witnessed in Taiwan.
Mr. Speaker, magkano ba yung tinatayang collection losses kapag binawasan ng stock transaction tax? No? Kasi, tama no, sa capital market efficiency bill, mas gagawing immediate yung reduction stock transaction mula 0.6% patungong 0.1%. So malaki talaga yung difference. Magkano yung tinatayang collection losses kapag binawasan yung stock transaction, STT, patungong 0.1%? Kasi nung 2019, tinatayang nasa 10 billion ang STT collections. Tama po ba?
So how do we end this? Okay. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, at the onset, we estimate around 2.5 billion losses on our stock transaction tax. If we are going to use the assumption that our base model or our transactions remain as it is right now.
So 2.5 billion ang mawawala.
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, we are working with the assumption that this is what is going to be lost if the transactions are constant. But we are working with the...
Ano po, mas mataas pa?
No.
Ganun ba,
No.
Mr. Speaker, ginong sponsor?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, if this is only constant, only if our transaction volume remains the same. But if we increase the volume wherein there is a greater effect, not only, you have to look at it in the whole ecosystem, Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, that the stock transaction tax, while we have a loss on the transaction tax, its contribution in the volume of increasing the market should redound to the benefit of increasing the size of our economy.
Magkano naman, Mr. Speaker, yung tinatayang revenue losses kapag binabaan yung dividends tax rate for non-resident aliens mula 25% patungong 10%?
Okay. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, for this, our estimate, if we keep on the constant of transaction, is 37.3 million pesos.
So overall, Mr. Speaker, how much will the government lose in revenue collections if this measure is passed?
Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleague, if we will only look at these numbers, it will look like that the government is going to lose. But we also have to consider that we are also taking into account the amount of capital that comes in to the economy if we also incentivize investors to come into the stock market by increasing the economy size. So we could not, if we will look at this, Mr. Speaker, from without the context of increasing the size of the economy, it may look like that this is a loss to the government. But this, if we put it into the context of the increase in the market size and the economy size, the increase of the stock, we are looking at an increase of about $77 billion. Mr. Speaker, distinguished colleagues, if the arithmetic and the behavior of the market is correct, we are looking at increasing the size of our economy by $77 billion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ganyan din yung sinabi sa atin sa Train 1. So, after Train 1, what we're seeing right now, di ba, hindi naman siya talaga nag-redound, no, Mr. Speaker. Binabaan natin yung taxes ng mga corporations, tapos nag-tax holiday pa tayo. Ang daming incentivization na nga na ginawa natin, Mr. Speaker, sa iba't ibang